After my father-in-law's funeral, my unemployed husband inherited $210 million, then left me with a smug grin. You're useless now, he sneered. I don't need you anymore. After the divorce, the lawyer chuckled. Did you even read the will? My ex went pale when he saw the shocking truth inside. I finally don't need your pathetic salary anymore, Christian said, tossing his apartment key on the kitchen table like he was folding a winning poker hand. 210 million, Serafina. That's what Dad left me. You've been useful for paying rent, but now. He shrugged with theatrical indifference. You're worthless to me. It had been exactly 36 hours since we'd buried Charles, his father who'd whispered strange last words to me about justice coming in unexpected ways. Now, as Christian strutted around our apartment planning his new millionaire lifestyle, I fingered the lawyer's business card in my pocket, the one that came with an urgent voicemail. Mrs. Carter, you need to attend the will reading. There's a contingency clause your husband doesn't know about. Christian pulled a bottle of champagne from our refrigerator, one I'd bought months ago for our anniversary that he'd forgotten. The pop of the cork felt like a gunshot in our small Chicago apartment. He didn't offer me a glass. Instead, he drank straight from the bottle while scrolling through Miami real estate listings on his phone. I'm thinking South Beach, he said, not looking at me. Maybe a penthouse. Something with a private elevator. You can keep this place. Consider it severance for your services. Services. 4 years of marriage reduced to a business transaction. 4 years of waking up at dawn to get to my financial analyst job downtown while he slept until noon. 4 years of watching my savings account drain into his endless stream of failed ventures. The food truck that never got permits, the app that never launched, the consulting firm that never found a single client. I thought back to when we'd met at that networking event 3 years ago at the Drake Hotel. The ballroom had been packed with Chicago's ambitious up-and-comers, everyone armed with business cards and elevator pitches. I'd gone because my boss insisted it would be good for visibility. I remember standing by the bar, nursing a glass of mediocre Chardonnay, when Christian appeared beside me. You look like someone who actually has a real job, he'd said, flashing that smile that should have warned me it was too practiced. I'm Christian Carter. Currently between ventures but by choice. I'm taking care of my father. He's not well. The story he'd spun that night was perfectly crafted for sympathy. His mother had died young, his father was ailing, and he'd sacrificed his promising career to be there for family. In a room full of people bragging about their portfolios and profit margins, his tale of filial devotion stood out. When he remembered my name 3 hours later in a crowd of 50 people, when he brought me a fresh drink without being asked, when he quoted something I'd said about market volatility back to me perfectly, I thought I'd found someone who actually paid attention. My dad built half the shopping complexes on the South Side, he told me over coffee the next morning. But I learned early that money isn't everything. When someone needs you, you show up. I was 35 then, 2 years past a divorce that had been like slowly deflating a balloon. No explosion, just a gradual loss of air until we were both empty. My ex-husband and I had simply grown apart, two parallel lines that never fought but never touched either. Christian's energy, his confidence, his way of making even unemployment sound strategic. It painted color into my gray, predictable life. Now, watching him plan his escape with his father's money, I remembered the first time I'd met Charles. Christian had finally invited me to dinner 6 months into our relationship. The apartment in Lincoln Park wasn't what I'd expected from Christian's descriptions of family wealth. It was comfortable but modest, filled with books instead of status symbols, wisdom instead of ostentation. Charles had been 78 then, but sharp as someone half his age. Within minutes of sitting down, he was asking me real questions about my work, not the polite surface-level stuff most people managed. A financial analyst, he'd said, adjusting his reading glasses. Tell me, what's your take on the current yield curve inversion? We talked for 2 hours about market dynamics while Christian sat between us, growing increasingly bored, checking his phone, occasionally throwing in buzzwords about disruption that had nothing to do with our conversation. At one point, while Christian was refilling drinks, Charles had leaned toward me. My son needs an anchor, he'd said quietly. Someone who understands that wealth without wisdom is just expensive foolishness. I hope you're that person, but more importantly, I hope you protect yourself too. The warning had been there, wrapped in fatherly concern. I'd chosen to hear only the hope. A year later, Charles had insisted on paying for our small wedding despite Christian's protests. Christian had wanted to invite what he called potential investors, people he'd collected business cards from who might be impressed by a lavish reception. Charles had quietly but firmly vetoed that plan. 20 guests, simple flowers, a modest reception. Marriage isn't a networking event, Charles had said, and Christian had pouted for weeks. During the ceremony, while Christian gave a toast that sounded more like a business pitch than a declaration of love, Charles had slipped me an envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000 and a note. For the emergencies I suspect will come. Remember, wisdom matters more than wealth. My mother, who'd flown in from Cleveland, had watched everything with worried eyes. Are you sure about this? She'd whispered during the reception. I'd been sure then. I'd been wrong. You still standing there? Christian's voice cut through my memories. He'd finished half the champagne bottle and was now pulling suits from our closet, tossing aside the ones he deemed not worthy of his new millionaire status. Daniel Morrison says the estate clears final probate tomorrow. I'll have the divorce papers ready by then. Daniel Morrison. Charles's lawyer, whose business card felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. The same Daniel Morrison who'd left me a voicemail just hours after the funeral. Mrs. Carter, it's imperative you attend the will reading. There are aspects of Charles's estate that require your presence. Please call me back immediately. Christian hadn't mentioned any will reading. According to him, everything was already settled, straightforward, his inheritance guaranteed. But Charles had been many things. Generous, wise, patient with his disappointing son, but he'd never been straightforward about anything important. I'm going to stay at the Ritz tonight, Christian announced, zipping up a suitcase I'd bought him 2 Christmases ago. Can't stand another night in this dump. This dump. The apartment I'd paid rent on for 4 years. The place where Charles had visited every Sunday until he got too sick. Always bringing groceries he claimed were extras. Always slipping money into my purse when Christian wasn't looking. Always staying for coffee and real conversation after his son inevitably disappeared to network at sports bars. As Christian headed for the door, pulling his suitcase behind him, he paused. Oh, and Serafina? Don't try to contest anything. Dad told me years ago I was his sole beneficiary. $210 million. It's all mine. The door slammed behind him, leaving me alone in the apartment that suddenly felt larger, emptier, but somehow less suffocating. I pulled out Daniel Morrison's card and my phone. Whatever Charles had planned, whatever justice he'd whispered about with his dying breath, I was about to find out. The phone rang once before Daniel answered, as if he'd been waiting. Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't interpret. We need to talk about Charles's will. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? And please, come alone. Don't mention this to Christian. I set down the phone after Daniel Morrison confirmed our morning meeting, my hands trembling slightly. The apartment felt different without Christian's presence, like a pressure valve had finally been released. I walked to our bedroom closet where he'd thrown his rejected clothes in a heap and started hanging them back up, needing something mechanical to do while my mind raced. 6 months into our marriage, I'd performed this exact same ritual, cleaning up after one of Christian's dramatic exits. That time, it had been about his food truck venture, the one he'd promised would revolutionize Chicago's lunch scene. He'd spent weeks crafting elaborate spreadsheets, designing logos, creating social media accounts for a business that existed only in his imagination. The Excel files had been works of art, color-coded projections showing profits that would triple within the first year. He'd even hired a graphic designer to create promotional materials for routes he'd never drive, serving food he'd never learned to cook. The permits alone had cost $3,000. The commercial kitchen equipment rental another $5,000. The wrapped vehicle that would serve as his mobile restaurant, $8,000 more, sitting in a storage facility on the south side gathering dust. All of it paid for with my savings, withdrawn in increments small enough that I'd convinced myself they were investments in our future. The morning he'd admitted the permits had expired and used, he'd actually tried to blame the city of Chicago. The bureaucracy in this city is designed to kill innovation, he'd said, pacing our living room while I stared at the final notice from the storage facility. They don't want independent entrepreneurs succeeding. They want us all to be corporate drones. When I'd pointed out that thousands of food trucks operated successfully in Chicago, that maybe the issue was his complete lack of food service experience or business plan beyond spreadsheets, He'd looked at me with genuine hurt. "I thought you believed in me," he'd said quietly, and somehow I'd ended up apologizing, comforting him over his failure that had cost me $16,000. That was the weekend Charles started his Sunday visits. He'd shown up at our door with 2 bags of groceries, claiming he'd bought too much for one person. Christian had barely looked up from his laptop where he was already researching his next venture, something about a revolutionary app that would disrupt the grocery delivery market. "Let me help you put these away," Charles had said, and while we unpacked vegetables and milk and bread I hadn't asked for but desperately needed, he'd slipped an envelope into my purse. Later I'd found $500 cash inside with a note. "For groceries. Don't mention it." Those Sunday visits became the rhythm that kept me sane. Charles would arrive at 10 in the morning, always with food, always with an excuse about buying too much or finding a great sale. Christian would tolerate his father's presence for about 30 minutes before announcing he had to meet potential investors, which we both knew meant watching sports at McGill's bar 3 blocks away. Once Christian left, Charles would make coffee. Real coffee, not the instant stuff I'd switched to for budget reasons, and we'd sit at our small kitchen table talking about everything except his son's failures. He taught me about dividend investing, about the power of compound interest, about financial strategies I already knew from my work but which took on new meaning when discussed with someone who'd actually built wealth rather than just analyzed it. "You have a gift for understanding money," he told me once. Christian never inherited that gift, I'm afraid. It was during one of those Sunday conversations about a year into the marriage that I'd found the credit card statements. I'd been looking for a pen in Christian's briefcase, the expensive leather one he carried everywhere despite having no actual business to conduct, when the folded papers fell out. 3 months of statements for a credit card I didn't know existed, showing charges that made my stomach turn. Lavo nightclub $1,200. RPM Steakhouse, $800 for a business dinner, on a Tuesday when he told me he was at a startup meetup. Custom suits from a Michigan Avenue boutique, tailored shirts, shoes that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. All labeled as business expenses in his careful handwriting on the margins, as if writing the words made them true. I'd confronted him that night, the statements spread across our bed like evidence in a trial. He'd looked at them with the detached air of someone reviewing someone else's problems. "You don't understand how business works," he'd said, straightening his collar, one of the new shirts I now recognized. "These aren't expenses, they're investments. The people I'm meeting, the connections I'm making, they expect a certain presentation. You think Mark Zuckerberg wore a cheap suit when he was raising capital? Mark Zuckerberg famously wears the same gray t-shirt every day." I'd shot back and for a moment his composure cracked. "That's because he's already made it. I'm still climbing. And if you can't support that climb, if you can't believe in the vision, then maybe you're the problem." The fight that followed was the worst we'd ever had, voices raised loud enough that our neighbor knocked on the wall. Christian had stormed out and I'd locked myself in the bathroom, sitting on the cold tile floor, crying quietly enough that he wouldn't hear if he came back. Through the door I could hear him in the living room, the sounds of a video game starting up, gunfire and explosions covering the silence between us. The next morning, Charles had arrived for his usual Sunday visit to find me red-eyed and exhausted. Christian had already left for his networking, and Charles had taken one look at me and pulled me into a hug that smelled like aftershave and safety. "How much?" he'd asked quietly. "I don't know. Maybe 20,000 total. Maybe more." He'd written me a check for $5,000 on the spot, insisting it was an early birthday gift, though my birthday was 4 months away. Then he'd sat down heavily, looking every one of his 79 years. "His mother left when he was 15, Charles had said, staring at his coffee. "Said she couldn't take the lying anymore. Not big lies, just constant small ones. Where he'd been, what he'd spent, who he'd talked to. Stories that didn't need to be stories. I thought it was teenage rebellion, that he'd grow out of it." He'd paused and I could see him wrestling with how much to share, how much truth about his son I could handle. I blame myself. After she left, I gave him everything, trying to fill that hole. Private schools, cars, money whenever he asked. I thought I was showing love, but I was just teaching him that there would always be someone to clean up his messes. We'd sat in silence for a while, the weight of his confession settling between us like another presence in the room. Finally, he'd looked at me with eyes that held decades of disappointment. "I won't tell you to leave him," he'd said. "But I need you to know that I understand if you do. And if you stay, we protect each other, yes?" From the worst of it. That became our unspoken agreement. Charles would help financially when he could, and I would shield him from the full extent of Christian's failures. We never discussed the money that passed between us, never acknowledged the elaborate fictions we maintained. When Christian bragged to his father about a new client or successful meeting, we'd both nod along. When he disappeared for hours on mysterious business, we'd pretend not to notice the charges at sports bars and nightclubs that followed. But I knew Charles saw everything. In his careful way, he was documenting his son's lies, watching the patterns, waiting for something I didn't yet understand. The understanding that passed between Charles and me that Sunday morning became the foundation of something I never expected. A friendship built on shared disappointment and mutual protection. We never spoke directly about Christian's lies again, but the silence between us said everything. Charles would slip money into my purse. I would pretend not to notice the bills piling up. And together we maintained the fiction that Christian was just one breakthrough away from success. 18 months into this careful dance, everything changed with a single phone call. I was in a client meeting downtown when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me excuse myself and answer. "Is this Serafina Carter?" The voice belonged to an elderly woman, nervous and formal. "I'm Mrs. Chin, Charles's neighbor. I found him on the stairs this morning. He seemed dizzy, confused. The paramedics are taking him to Northwestern Memorial." The meeting became a blur of hasty apologies and grabbed belongings. I called Christian 7 times on my way to the hospital, each call going straight to voicemail. When I finally reached him, he was at a golf course in Schaumburg, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses audible in the background. "Dad fell. Is he okay?" His voice carried the appropriate notes of concern, but I could hear the calculation underneath, the mental math of how this might affect him. Charles was sitting up in his hospital bed when I arrived, looking annoyed at all the fuss. The doctor explained it was a mild case of vertigo complicated by dehydration, nothing serious, but at his age living alone posed risks. Charles waved off their concerns, insisting he was perfectly capable of taking care of himself, but I saw the slight tremor in his hands, the way he gripped the bed rail when he thought no one was looking. Christian arrived 3 hours later, still in his golf attire, and delivered what might have been the performance of his lifetime. He took his father's hand, his eyes actually producing tears, and announced with great ceremony that he was giving up his current business venture to become Charles's full-time caregiver. "Dad, you've given me everything," he said loud enough for the nurses to hear. "Now it's my turn. I'm moving back home. I'll take care of you. This is what family does." Charles looked at me over Christian's bowed head, and I saw resignation mixed with something else. Hope, maybe, that this crisis might finally be the thing that changed his son. I wanted to share that hope, but the speech sounded too polished, too perfect, like Christian had rehearsed it on the drive over. For exactly 1 week, Christian played the devoted son. He moved some clothes to Charles's apartment, posted photos on social media of him cooking breakfast for his father, making sure everyone knew what a sacrifice he was making. On day 8, I came home early from work with a migraine and saw something that made my headache instantly worse. A woman in navy scrubs was leaving our apartment building, checking her phone as she walked to a sedan parked outside. She looked professional, competent, the kind of private nurse that costs several $100s a day. I watched her drive away, then went upstairs to find Christian on our couch, playing an online poker game on his laptop. "How's your dad?" I asked carefully. Good. Just left him napping. Made him lunch and everything." The lie came so easily, so naturally, that if I hadn't seen the nurse myself, I would have believed him. That night I did something I'm not proud of. I went through Christian's email while he slept, finding the correspondence with the home care agency. He'd hired them the day after his grand announcement, billing Charles directly for round-the-clock care while telling his father he was doing everything himself. The worst part was an email where Christian had instructed the agency to have their nurses wear regular clothes when entering and leaving the building, to maintain discretion. The bills were staggering. $4,000 a week for care Christian claimed to be providing himself. Meanwhile, he spent maybe an hour a day with Charles, usually during lunch, posting photos to maintain the illusion. The rest of his time was devoted to spending money with an urgency that frightened me. Designer clothes began appearing in our closet, tags carefully removed but receipts hidden in jacket pockets. A Tag Heuer watch materialized on his wrist, which he claimed was a gift from a grateful business contact. When I questioned him about the $3,000 charge on our credit card, he had an elaborate story about an investor who'd paid him back in cash, which he'd used to pay off the card before interest hit. Besides, he'd said, examining his new watch, Dad's not going to last forever. When the inheritance comes through, $3,000 will be nothing. We're just borrowing against our future. Our future. As if I hadn't noticed he'd started researching Miami condos, as if I hadn't seen the messages to old college friends about being single again soon, as if I was too stupid to recognize I was being replaced by the promise of money that didn't even exist yet. The next 2 months passed in a haze of Christian's escalating purchases and Charles's declining health. The vertigo had been a warning sign of larger issues. His heart was failing slowly but steadily. The man who'd once spent hours discussing market strategies with me could barely stay awake through a short visit. Christian would sit beside his father's bed, scrolling through his phone, occasionally looking up to pat Charles's hand when nurses walked by. It was during one of these visits, on what would be Charles's last lucid day, that everything became clear. Christian had stepped out to take a call. Another fictional investor, another imaginary deal, leaving Charles and me alone. His grip on my hand was surprisingly strong, urgent. "Serafina," he whispered, his voice rough but clear. "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," I said, leaning closer. "The will reading. After I'm gone. You must be there. No matter what Christian says, no matter what excuse he gives. Promise me." "I promise, but Charles. Daniel Morrison, my lawyer. He has instructions. Everything is arranged." His eyes, clouded with medication and pain, suddenly sharpened. "I know about the nurse. I've always known. Just like I know about the credit cards, the lies, all of it." My face must have shown my shock because he squeezed my hand gently. "A father knows his son," he said. "But sometimes wisdom matters more than blood. Remember that. Wisdom matters more than wealth, more than anything." He fumbled at his bedside table, pulling out a small leather journal, its cover soft with age. Inside the front cover, in shaky handwriting, he'd inscribed, "For Serafina's thoughts, and for truth when the time comes." "Keep this," he said. "Write down everything. The truth, not the story Christian tells. Someone should remember what really happened." Christian returned then, pocketing his phone with the satisfied look of someone who'd just sold another lie. He glanced at his father, then at his watch, the expensive one that couldn't buy him a conscience. "Dad looks tired," he announced. "We should go. The nurse will be here soon." He caught himself, quickly adding, I'll come back this evening to check on him." Charles closed his eyes, still holding my hand. "Remember your promise," he whispered so quietly Christian didn't hear. 3 days later, Charles died in his sleep, finally free from both his failing heart and his failing son. Christian was at a bar when it happened, celebrating a deal that didn't exist with money he didn't yet have. I was the one who got the call, the one who sat with Charles's body until the funeral home came, the one who truly mourned. The funeral director's assistant helped me gather Charles's personal effects from the hospital room while Christian waited in the car, engine running. His reading glasses sat folded on the nightstand next to the leather journal he'd given me just days earlier. The nurse who'd been on duty when Charles passed touched my shoulder gently and whispered that he'd gone peacefully at 5:47 a.m. No pain, just a quiet slipping away like someone finally allowed to rest. Christian had taken the call at 6 a.m., and by 6:15 he was already texting someone about meeting for drinks to celebrate a business opportunity. The drive home from Northwestern Memorial stretched through morning traffic, giving me too much time to watch Christian's transformation unfold. His eyes were still red when we pulled out of the parking garage, but by the time we reached Lakeshore Drive he was dictating voice memos about liquidating assets and researching tax implications of large inheritances. At a red light near Oak Street, I caught him typing Miami beachfront condos over $5 million into his phone browser. Charles's body was still warm, and his son was already spending money that existed only in his imagination. "We need to call Brennan's funeral home," I said, breaking the silence. "Your father mentioned once that he wanted—" "Whatever's fastest," Christian interrupted, merging aggressively into the left lane. "Simple service, quick burial. Dad wouldn't want a fuss." Charles had actually told me he wanted his book club friends to read passages from his favorite novels at the service, that he wanted jazz music because it reminded him of his youth, that he hoped people would share stories over good wine and remember him laughing. None of that mattered to Christian, who saw his father's death as an inconvenient delay before his payday. By the time we reached our apartment, Christian had contacted 3 real estate agents in Miami, scheduled a call with an estate attorney he'd found online, and researched Lamborghini dealerships. I sat at our kitchen table, calling Charles's friends from the numbers in his address book, while Christian paced behind me having loud conversations about investment opportunities and portfolio diversification with people who didn't yet know he had no money to invest. The funeral took place 2 days later at a chapel in Skokie that Christian had chosen because they offered a package deal. February rain turned the cemetery into a mud field that grabbed at our shoes as we walked to the graveside. Christian had insisted on giving the eulogy, pulling up a template on his phone in the car and literally reading from the screen at the podium. Charles was a loving father who taught me everything I know about business, he said, which was technically true since Charles had taught him nothing and he knew nothing. He lived a full life and leaves behind a legacy of success. Generic words that could have been about anyone's father, delivered with all the emotion of a weather report. During the burial ceremony, while the rabbi spoke about dust and return and eternal rest, Christian stood beside me checking his phone every 30 seconds. I watched him typing with one hand, the other holding a black umbrella that he angled to shield his screen from the rain but not his father's casket. The estate lawyer had apparently messaged him about probate timelines, and that was more important than watching Charles being lowered into the ground. The reception afterward revealed everything I'd been too blind to see. Charles's book club friends, gentle people in their 70s and 80s who'd known him for decades, formed a protective circle around me while actively avoiding Christian. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd led their discussions of Hemingway and Morrison, pulled me aside near the coffee station. "Charles worried about you," she said quietly, her hand warm on mine. "He made us promise to check on you after everything settles." "After what settles?" I asked, but she just squeezed my hand and moved away as Christian approached, his false smile preceding him like a warning. "Great turnout," he said, though fewer than 20 people had come. "Dad would have been proud." He checked his watch, a flash of impatience crossing his face. "How much longer do we need to stay?" We left an hour later, Christian complaining about the waste of time while I sat silent in the passenger seat, holding a cardboard box of Charles's books that Mrs. Rodriguez had insisted I take. "He would want you to have these," she'd said, and something in her tone suggested she knew more than she was saying. That night, Christian opened a bottle of champagne he'd been saving for a special occasion. "To new beginnings," he toasted himself since I hadn't taken a glass. He drank most of the bottle while scrolling through yacht listings on his laptop, occasionally reading prices aloud like he was selecting items from a restaurant menu. I went to bed early, exhausted from grief and the effort of pretending Christian's behavior wasn't appalling. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there listening to him on the phone in the living room, his voice getting louder as the champagne took effect, making promises about investments and partnerships that would materialize once his funds cleared. The morning after the burial, I woke to find Christian already awake, dressed in his best suit, papers spread across our kitchen table. My black funeral dress still hung on the bathroom door where I'd left it the night before. I hadn't even had coffee yet when he started his presentation. $210 million, he announced, standing like he was addressing a board meeting. "That's what Dad's estate is worth. I've already talked to Daniel Morrison, Dad's lawyer. The probate should clear within days." He pushed the divorce papers across the table with the casual efficiency of someone closing a business deal. "I finally don't need your pathetic salary anymore. You've been useful for paying rent, but now? You're worthless to me." The words should have destroyed me. Should have sent me reeling, crying, begging. Instead, I felt something else entirely, a cold clarity like ice water in my veins. Charles's voice echoed in my memory. "Wisdom matters more than wealth." The leather journal he'd given me sat in my purse, and tucked inside was Daniel Morrison's business card with that urgent voicemail I still hadn't returned. "Fine," I heard myself say, my voice steady as I reached for Christian's offered pen. "But I want this done properly. Through lawyers." "Whatever makes you feel better," Christian laughed, already mentally decorating his Miami penthouse. "Daniel will handle everything. Estate, divorce, all of it. Clean break." I signed my name with deliberate care, each letter a small goodbye to the life I'd tried to build with someone incapable of building anything. Christian snatched the papers back, his grin so wide it looked painful. "You can keep this dump," he said, gesturing around our apartment with disdain. Consider it severance. 20 minutes later, I stood in our bedroom packing a single suitcase, choosing only essentials. Christian's celebratory phone calls echoed from the living room. Friends, acquaintances, anyone who would listen to his grand plans. I'm thinking of starting a hedge fund, I heard him say. With 200 million in capital, I could really make waves. The elevator in our building took forever, giving me too much time to think. But I wasn't thinking about Christian or the divorce or even the money. I was thinking about Charles's grip on my hand, surprisingly strong for a dying man, and his insistence that I attend the will reading. About Mrs. Rodriguez's meaningful looks and careful words. About Daniel Morrison's urgent voicemail that Christian didn't know existed. The taxi driver who picked me up outside studied me in his rearview mirror as I sat clutching my suitcase like a life preserver. You okay, miss? He asked gently. Rough morning. I'm about to find out, I said, pulling out my phone to finally return Daniel Morrison's call. The phone rang twice before Daniel Morrison answered, his voice professional but carrying an undertone I couldn't quite identify. Mrs. Carter, I've been expecting your call. Are you somewhere private where we can speak? The taxi had just pulled up to a Hampton Inn near O'Hare Airport, far enough from our Lincoln Park apartment that Christian wouldn't accidentally find me. I asked the driver to wait while I finished the call, watching planes take off through the gray February morning, each one carrying people toward new lives while mine hung suspended between what was and what might be. Mr. Morrison, your voicemail mentioned something about the will reading. Christian said everything was already settled. There was a pause, then what sounded like papers shuffling. Mrs. Carter, your husband has made several assumptions about his father's estate. Charles was very specific in his instructions. Both you and Christian must attend the formal reading. Are you available tomorrow at 10? Christian mentioned the estate is worth 210 million. I said, needing to understand what game was being played. The gross value of the estate is indeed substantial, Daniel replied carefully, each word measured like ingredients in a delicate recipe. However, Charles was very particular about the distribution terms. I cannot say more until the formal reading, but I strongly advise you to attend. Charles insisted on it. After confirming I would be there, I paid the taxi driver and checked into the hotel using the credit card Christian didn't know about, the one I'd kept for emergencies since my first marriage. The room was standard business traveler bland, beige walls, dark curtains, a bed that looked identical to thousands of others across the country. It felt appropriate somehow, this neutral space between my old life and whatever came next. For the first time in 3 years I called in sick to work. My supervisor, Janet, sounded genuinely concerned. Serafina, you haven't missed a day since you started. Is everything all right? Family emergency, I said, which was true enough. I need a few days to sort things out. I ordered room service that afternoon. A club sandwich that might as well have been cardboard for all I tasted it. The television played cable news on mute while I scrolled through apartment listings on my laptop, trying to imagine starting over at 38 with whatever remained after Christian's financial devastation. Studio apartments in Rogers Park, one-bedrooms in Uptown, places where the radiators clanged and the walls were thin but the rent was manageable on a single income. That evening, while unpacking my hastily filled suitcase, I found Charles's leather journal at the bottom, wrapped in one of my sweaters. Inside the front cover, beneath his inscription about it being for my thoughts, was an envelope I hadn't noticed before. My name was written across it in Charles's shaky handwriting, dated exactly 1 month before his death. The letter inside was 3 pages, written in bursts as his strength allowed, the handwriting growing weaker toward the end. My dear Serafina, it began. If you're reading this, then things have unfolded as I feared they would. First, I owe you an apology. I knew who Christian was when you married him. I had hoped, prayed, that your influence might change him. Instead, he simply used your kindness as another resource to exploit. I had to set the letter down, my hands trembling. Outside, planes continued their departures, their lights blinking through the gathering dusk. After a moment, I continued reading. Christian has always been this way. His mother, God rest her soul, left when she couldn't bear the lying anymore. I blamed myself, tried to compensate with money, with things, with endless second chances. Each time I made him worse. You asked once why I lived so modestly despite my wealth. The truth is, I've been protecting that wealth from my son for years, knowing he would destroy himself with it. The next paragraph made my breath catch. I've made provisions in my will that Christian knows nothing about. He's never read it despite my attempts to discuss it with him. He assumes, as he always does, that everything will simply flow to him. Daniel Morrison has my complete instructions. Trust him. Attend the reading no matter what Christian says or does. Justice has a way of arriving in unexpected packages. The letter concluded with words that brought tears I thought I'd exhausted. You deserved better than the hand you were dealt. Christian's marriage to you was the only good decision he ever made, though he'll never understand why. Be strong, my dear. What's coming will be difficult but necessary. And please don't blame yourself for any of this. Some people cannot be saved, only survived. I folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the journal. My phone, which I'd set to silent, showed 17 missed calls from Christian and dozens of text messages. The progression was almost comedic in its predictability. First demands, "Where are you? This is ridiculous." Then anger, "You don't get to just disappear. We have things to discuss." Followed by false concern, "I'm worried about you. Just let me know you're safe." Then manipulation, "We can work this out. Maybe I was too hasty." Back to anger, "You're being childish. Grow up." Threats appeared next, "I'll take everything in the divorce. You'll get nothing." And finally, gloating, "Estate clears probate tomorrow. Thanks for making this easy by leaving. By the way, keeping the apartment was generous of me. You should be grateful." I didn't respond to any of them. Let him believe he'd won, that I'd simply fled in defeat. The truth would arrive soon enough, wrapped in legal language and witnessed by Daniel Morrison's professional presence. That night, I lay in the hotel bed staring at the ceiling, city lights filtering through the curtains creating patterns that shifted with each passing car. Somewhere across Chicago, Christian was probably out celebrating his imaginary fortune, running up tabs he couldn't pay, making promises he couldn't keep. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but all I felt was tired, bone-deep, soul-deep tired from years of propping up someone who confused taking with earning. On the second day, I forced myself to eat breakfast in the hotel lobby, surrounded by business travelers checking emails and families heading to the airport. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that at the next table sat a woman whose entire existence had exploded and reformed in the span of 72 hours. I spent the afternoon in the hotel's business center, updating my resume and researching market salaries for financial analysts. If nothing else came from Charles's mysterious provisions, at least I could rebuild my career without Christian draining every paycheck. The third morning arrived gray and bitter cold, perfect weather for revelations. Daniel Morrison called at 8 to confirm the meeting. "Both parties have confirmed attendance," he said formally. "I want to prepare you that this may be emotionally challenging." Charles anticipated various reactions. "Will Christian be getting his $210 million? I asked directly. Daniel's pause was eloquent. "Mr. Carter will be receiving exactly what his father intended him to receive, based on the conditions Charles established. Nothing more, nothing less." I chose my clothes carefully, professional black slacks and a gray blazer, the uniform of someone with nothing to prove and nothing to hide. The woman in the hotel mirror looked older than 38 but stronger somehow, like pressure had compressed her into something harder and more valuable. The elevator in Daniel Morrison's building climbed 23 floors while I studied my reflection in its polished doors. The professional woman staring back looked composed, but underneath, my pulse hammered with anticipation. I stepped out into a reception area that whispered old money, dark wood paneling, leather chairs that had held decades of secrets, oil paintings of Chicago's skyline before the glass towers took over. Christian was already there, sprawled in one of those leather chairs like he owned the place. The new suit he wore still had the subtle sheen of fresh fabric, probably purchased yesterday with a credit card he couldn't pay. A Rolex, fake I could tell from the way the second hand ticked rather than swept, adorned his wrist. He didn't look up from his phone when I entered, his fingers flying across the screen as he typed what were undoubtedly more promises about investments he'd soon make. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," the receptionist announced. "Mr. Morrison will see you now." Only then did Christian acknowledge my presence, his eyes sliding over me with dismissive calculation. I wore the same charcoal blazer I'd worn to a dozen client meetings, the same practical slacks, the same modest watch Charles had given me for Christmas 2 years ago. Next to Christian's desperate display of imagined wealth, I looked exactly like what I was. Someone who worked for a living. Daniel Morrison's office occupied a corner of the building, windows on two sides offering a view of the Chicago River winding through the city like a gray ribbon. The man himself stood as we entered, silver-haired and dignified in a way that made Christian's flashy suit look even more like a costume. His desk, a massive mahogany piece that could have doubled as a dining table, dominated the room. "Please sit," Daniel said, gesturing to two chairs positioned side by side facing his desk. Christian immediately tried to angle his chair away from mine, as if proximity to me might contaminate his impending fortune. Daniel watched this small performance with an expression I couldn't read, then settled into his own chair with the careful movements of someone who had all the time in the world. "Before we begin," Daniel said, pulling a thick folder from his desk drawer, "I need to confirm some details. Christian, you filed for divorce from Serafina 3 days ago, correct?" Christian waved his hand impatiently. Yes, it's all filed. Can we get to the estate distribution? I have appointments this afternoon." No, he didn't. But the lie came as naturally as breathing. "And you've both signed the papers?" Daniel continued, his tone perfectly neutral. "Signed and submitted," Christian confirmed, leaning forward eagerly. "Now, about the $210 million. Did you read your father's will, Christian?" Daniel interrupted, the question dropping into the room like a stone into still water. Christian's eagerness stuttered. Dad told me years ago. I'm the sole beneficiary," he said. "I asked if you've read the actual will," Daniel repeated, sliding the folder across the mahogany surface with deliberate precision. "The document itself. Not what you remember from conversations." I watched Christian's face shift from annoyance to uncertainty. His hand hesitated before taking the folder, and I saw Daniel's mouth twitch in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Christian opened the folder with the confidence of someone about to confirm what he already knew. I watched his eyes scan the first page, the legal language that established Charles's identity, his soundness of mind, the date of the will's last revision, just 1 month before his death. Christian's forehead creased slightly, probably wondering why his father had updated his will so recently, but he pressed on. The second page is where everything changed. I could track his reading by the way his face transformed. First, confusion as he encountered language about contingencies and conditions. Then disbelief as he reached the marriage clause, the requirement that he remain married to me for 1 full year after Charles's death to inherit the full estate. His hands began trembling as he found the next section, the one about the charitable trust for financial literacy that would receive the bulk of the estate if the marriage condition wasn't met. "This can't be right," Christian whispered, his voice barely audible. "There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake," Daniel said calmly. "Your father was quite specific. The full inheritance of $210 million was contingent upon your maintaining your marriage to Serafina. He believed, and I'm quoting directly, that Christian needs Serafina's wisdom and stability to handle such wealth responsibly." Christian's face had gone pale, making his fake tan look orange in the morning light streaming through the windows. "But I filed for divorce. We can stop it. We can withdraw the papers." He turned to me, his eyes wild with panic. "Serafina, we can fix this. Tell him we've reconciled." Daniel continued as if Christian hadn't spoken. "According to the terms, in the event of divorce proceedings initiated by you within 1 year of Charles's death, the entire estate transfers to the Harbor Light Foundation for Financial Literacy, minus a small personal stipend." "How small?" Christian's voice cracked on the word. $50,000, Daniel replied. "Your father felt this was, and I quote, sufficient for Christian to start over and hopefully learn the value of work and loyalty." The silence that followed was complete. Even the city noise from 23 floors below seemed to pause. Christian stared at the will as if the words might rearrange themselves if he looked hard enough. His new suit suddenly seemed to hang wrong on his shoulders, like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. Then came the bargaining. "Serafina, please," Christian said, turning to me fully for the first time since I'd entered the office. "We can work this out. I was hasty, emotional from grief. We don't have to go through with the divorce." I met his eyes steadily. "You told me I was worthless to you." "I didn't mean it. I was upset about Dad. You know how grief affects people." You were Googling Miami condos before his body was cold. Christian's tactics shifted rapidly, cycling through every manipulation he'd ever used. First came promises, we can split it. 100 million each. More money than either of us could spend. Then rationalization, Dad would want us to work this out. He loved us both. Followed by threats, I'll contest the will. This is undue influence. You poisoned him against me. And finally, tears. Actual tears that might have moved me if I hadn't watched him practice crying in our bathroom mirror before investor meetings. Christian, I said, my voice calm in the way that comes when you've moved past anger into something clearer. You spent 4 years living off my salary while pretending to be an entrepreneur. You lied to your dying father about caring for him while hiring a nurse with his own money. You counted the days until his death like an advent calendar filled with $100 bills. And the moment you thought you didn't need me, you threw me away. I stood, smoothing my practical slacks, and looked down at the man I'd once thought I could save with enough patience and support. Your father knew exactly who you are. That's why he put these conditions in place. He wanted to teach you one final lesson about the value of loyalty and honest work. I turned to Daniel. Please proceed with the divorces filed. I believe Charles would be pleased to know his fortune will help thousands of people learn financial literacy, something his son never bothered to acquire. Christian's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally a kind of broken desperation that might have been the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him in years. Christian's broken desperation hung in the air for only a moment before it transformed into something uglier. He shot to his feet, the leather chair spinning behind him, and pointed an accusatory finger at me. You planned this. You and Dad conspired against me. You turned him against his own son. His voice rose with each word, echoing off the law office's wood-paneled walls. Daniel remained seated, calm as a lake while Christian raged like a storm above it. I stayed in my chair, watching the man I'd married reveal every layer of entitlement and delusion he'd carefully hidden behind charm and false promises. Mr. Carter, Daniel said evenly, I can assure you that your father's will was drafted entirely at his discretion. Mrs. Carter had no knowledge of its contents until this moment. That's impossible. Christian slammed his hand on the mahogany desk, making a crystal paperweight jump. She must have manipulated him. He was sick, vulnerable. This is undue influence, elder abuse, something. Daniel opened another folder, pulling out several documents with official seals. Your father updated his will multiple times over the past 5 years, each version adding more specific conditions regarding your inheritance. He met with me monthly while in perfect mental health. We have medical evaluations, witness statements, and video recordings of each session where he explicitly stated his reasoning. Video recordings? Christian's rage flickered into uncertainty. Your father insisted on documenting everything. He anticipated you might contest the will. Daniel pulled out a tablet, swiping to a file dated 6 weeks before Charles's death. Would you like to see your father explaining, in his own words, why he structured his estate this way? Christian sank back into his chair as if Daniel had pulled a gun rather than a tablet. No, I don't. That's not necessary. But Daniel continued, relentless in his professional courtesy. There's more you should understand about the distribution. The $50,000 designated for you isn't freely accessible. Your father placed it in a trust with specific conditions. What conditions? Christian's voice had shrunk to barely a whisper. You must provide proof of employment to access the funds. Full-time employment maintained for at least 6 months. The trust will release $10,000 upon proof of hire, then the remaining $40,000 after 6 months of verified employment. Christian laughed, but it sounded more like choking. He's trying to control me even from the grave. He's trying to teach you what he couldn't while alive, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since standing to leave. Christian turned on me again, but this time his anger had curdled into something desperate and mean. You think you've won something here? You get nothing either. You heard him, the money goes to charity, not you. Daniel cleared his throat. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. Mr. Carter, there's a separate provision for Mrs. Carter. He pulled out yet another document. Charles left her a personal bequest of $25,000, along with this note. He handed me an envelope with my name in Charles's handwriting. Inside, a brief message. For the fresh start you deserve, And for the kindness you showed an old man who didn't deserve it. Use this to build the life Christian never could give you. $25,000. Not life-changing money, but enough to secure a new apartment, pay off the credit cards Christian had maxed out, maybe even take a vacation somewhere warm where I could remember what it felt like to relax. This is insane, Christian muttered, running his hands through his carefully styled hair until it stood in disarray. $210 million, and it's all going to strangers because I filed for divorce 3 days too early? Not strangers, Daniel corrected. The Harbor Light Foundation for Financial Literacy. Your father served on several nonprofit boards and hand-selected the trustees for this foundation. They include educators, social workers, and financial counselors who will use the funds to teach practical money management to underserved communities. Your father called it his true legacy. Christian's face contorted as the full weight of his situation crashed down. I have nothing. No job, no savings, no apartment. I spent everything I had because I thought. He trailed off, unable to admit he'd been counting his father's money before the man was even buried. You have $50,000 waiting once you maintain employment, Daniel reminded him. That's more than many people start with. I'm 41 years old. Christian's voice cracked again, rising toward hysteria. I haven't had a real job in 3 years. Who's going to hire me? For what? His shouting had reached a pitch that made Daniel subtly press a button under his desk. Within seconds, a security guard appeared in the doorway, his presence quiet but unmistakable. Mr. Carter, Daniel said, standing now, I think we've covered everything necessary today. The documents will be filed with the court this afternoon. If you need assistance understanding the trust terms, my assistant can provide you with a referral to an employment counselor. Christian looked between Daniel, the security guard, and me, his face cycling through emotions like a slot machine spinning toward inevitable loss. Finally, he deflated entirely, slumping in the expensive leather chair like all his bones had dissolved. How am I supposed to survive? He asked the room, the question so small it barely traveled across the desk. The same way everyone else does, I said, gathering my purse and the envelope with Charles's note. By working. The security guard stepped aside as I moved toward the door. Behind me, I heard Christian's voice one more time, not shouting now but worse. Broken in a way that might have moved me if I hadn't spent 4 years being broken by his selfishness. Serafina, please. We could have had everything. I paused at the threshold but didn't turn around. No, Christian. You could have had everything. All you had to do was value what you already had. The elevator ride down felt like ascending rather than descending, each floor carrying me further from the weight of Christian's collapse. In the lobby, I stopped at a bench to read Charles's note again, letting his words sink in properly. A fresh start. Not a fortune but enough to build something real, something mine. 1 week later, Daniel Morrison called to confirm what I already knew in my heart. The divorce had been finalized without contest. Christian hadn't even hired a lawyer, probably because he couldn't afford one. The estate had been distributed exactly as Charles intended. The foundation had received its initial funding and was already setting up programs across Chicago's South Side, exactly where Charles had built his shopping centers decades ago. There's one more thing, Daniel said, his professional tone warming slightly. Charles left instructions for me to tell you this only after everything was settled. He wanted you to know that of all the investments he made in his lifetime, introducing you to his son was the one that hurt him most. But seeing who you were despite Christian's influence was what gave him hope in the end. Daniel's words about Charles's final message stayed with me as I hung up the phone. The late afternoon sun streamed through my hotel window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations in the air. I had $25,000, a finalized divorce, and for the first time in 4 years, no one else's failures to manage. The freedom felt strange, like wearing shoes after years of walking on broken glass. 2 weeks after that phone call, I signed the lease on a studio apartment in the Loop. The building was older, with radiators that clanged in winter and windows that stuck in summer, but the view stretched across Grant Park to Lake Michigan. The space was barely 600 square feet, smaller than just the living room in the apartment I'd shared with Christian, but every inch belonged to me. The first night there, I sat on the floor with Chinese takeout, surrounded by boxes, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: contentment. No one would criticize my choice of curtains or call my furniture purchases wasteful. No one would drain my bank account for fictional business ventures. The walls were mine to paint, the silence mine to fill or preserve. I hung Charles's photograph on the bookshelf I'd bought from a second-hand store on Milwaukee Avenue. It was from one of our Sunday conversations, caught mid-laugh at something I'd said about market predictions. His eyes crinkled with genuine warmth, the kind of expression Christian had never inherited or learned to fake. Below the photo I placed the leather journal he'd given me, now filled with my own thoughts about starting over. The foundation had sent me volunteer orientation materials, and I spread them across my small dining table, studying the curriculum they used for financial literacy classes. Basic budgeting, understanding credit, the difference between wants and needs. Concepts so simple yet so foreign to Christian's way of thinking. I thought about Charles designing this program, knowing his son would never benefit from it but hoping others would. My first volunteer session was scheduled for Saturday morning at a community center on the south side, one of the buildings Charles had helped develop in the 1990s. The irony wasn't lost on me. I would be teaching financial wisdom in a place Charles built, using money Charles left, to prevent people from becoming what Christian had become. Meanwhile, Christian's new reality unfolded through fragments that reached me through mutual acquaintances. Tom from my office mentioned seeing him at a job fair at Navy Pier, wearing the same designer suit that now looked worn at the edges, handing out resumes to companies that hired entry-level sales representatives. The image was almost picaresque. The man who'd spent years pretending to be a CEO now begging for a chance to make cold calls. Rachel, who worked at the bank where we'd had our joint account, told me he'd tried to open a business line of credit using his father's estate as collateral. When she'd explained that he had no claim to the estate, he'd apparently stood at her desk for 10 minutes, unable to comprehend that his inheritance had evaporated. She'd had to call security when he refused to leave, insisting there must be some mistake. The most telling update came from Mrs. Chin, Charles's former neighbor, who called me one evening 3 months after the will reading. Christian had moved into Charles's old apartment, not out of sentiment, but because it was rent-controlled and the landlord, who'd known Charles for 30 years, had agreed to let him stay for 6 months at reduced rent out of respect for his father's memory. "He looks terrible," Mrs. Chin said, her voice mixing pity with disapproval. "Thin, unshaven. I saw him carrying grocery bags from the dollar store yesterday. The same boy who used to brag about his business ventures now can't afford proper groceries." I felt no satisfaction hearing this, just a hollow acknowledgement that consequences had finally found someone who'd spent his life avoiding them. Christian was learning what I'd known all along, that survival required actual work, not just the performance of it. Eventually, word reached me that he'd found employment at a call center in Schaumburg, the kind that sold extended warranties for appliances. The same man who'd spent $40,000 of my money on networking lunches now spent his days reading from scripts, trying to convince strangers to buy something they didn't need. His first paycheck would unlock part of his trust fund, but $10,000 wouldn't go far for someone who'd never learned to budget. My Saturdays at the foundation became the highlight of my week. The community center filled with people hungry to learn. Single mothers stretching minimum wage across impossible math, elderly folks trying to understand reverse mortgages, young couples saving for their first home. They came with notebooks and questions, with hope despite their struggles, reminding me that financial stress didn't have to mean financial ignorance. During one session, a woman named Maria asked about dealing with family members who constantly borrowed money. "My brother always has an emergency," she said. "Always a big opportunity that needs just a little investment." The other participants nodded knowingly, and I thought of Christian, of all the emergencies and opportunities that had drained my accounts. "Sometimes," I said, choosing my words carefully, "the kindest thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their choices. Support doesn't mean enabling." After class, I often stayed to help individual participants with specific questions. One afternoon, while helping a young man understand compound interest, I noticed a new portrait hanging in the center's main hall. Charles's face looked out from an ornate frame, a brass plaque beneath reading, "Charles Morrison, Builder of Communities, Teacher of Wisdom." The center director, James, noticed me looking. "Did you know him?" he asked. "He was my father-in-law," I said, then corrected myself. "Former father-in-law." James studied me for a moment, recognition dawning. "You're Serafina. He mentioned you in his foundation documents. Said you understood the value of both money and character." 6 months after the will reading, I received an unexpected package at my studio apartment. Inside was a leather-bound book, Charles's personal journal from his final year. A note from Daniel Morrison explained that Charles had instructed him to send it to me after sufficient time had passed. The entries revealed everything. Charles had discovered Christian's deception about the nurse through a credit card statement Christian had carelessly left at his apartment. He'd known for months that his son was billing him for care he wasn't providing. The betrayal had broken something in Charles, but it had also crystallized his final plan. One entry, dated 2 months before his death, stood out. Christian believes inheritance is his right, not his privilege. He cannot learn from gifts, only from consequences. The will I've crafted isn't cruel. It's the education I failed to give him while alive. And Serafina, dear Serafina, deserves to know that she was never the problem. She was the only good decision Christian ever made, and he threw her away for money that was never going to save him. I closed the journal and looked out at Lake Michigan, the evening light turning the water to gold. Somewhere in Schaumburg, Christian was probably finishing his shift at the call center, heading back to his father's old apartment to count the days until his 6-month employment requirement was met. He would survive, perhaps even learn something, though I doubted he would ever understand the real lesson Charles had tried to teach. If this story of calculated justice and hidden inheritance clauses had you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Daniel Morrison slowly slid that will across the mahogany desk, watching Christian's face transform as he realized his father had outsmarted him from beyond the grave. What was your favorite moment of poetic justice? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more thrilling stories of betrayal, wisdom, and unexpected reversals. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.